So today I want to talk to you a little bit about recipes. Recipes are one of those things that if you've never really cooked before, you think you read through a recipe and you think you could probably handle it. But I want to give you a method in which to look at a recipe and make it much easier for you to complete what's on the page. So the first thing I want you to do, and this is actually advice from Jacques Pepin, is the first time you have a recipe, make the recipe by the book. Try to be as exact as you can, try to measure out as much as you can, try to follow the directions as closely as you can. Once you've made it one time, then you can go through and see if you want to tweak it. I know when I first started cooking, I would look at a recipe and think I knew exactly what that recipe was telling me to do. And then I would, instead of making the recipe all the way through one time, I would say, oh, well, I know what the eggs are doing in this recipe, or I know what the water is doing in this recipe, so I'll replace it with this, or I'll replace it with that, or I'll change things around. And a lot of times, recipes don't turn out that way. I remember specifically one time when I was trying to make falafel, I really screwed up this recipe for falafel 3 or 4 times thinking I could tweak it. And the moment I followed it all the way through perfectly to the letter, it turned out great. Now, ever since then, I can tweak it as much as I want because I know what does what in the recipe. So that's my first piece of advice to you. As a new cook, always try to follow the recipe the first time you do it exactly. Now, you also, when you're baking, you want to try to be way more precise than when you're cooking. So baking is more of a science, cooking is more of an art. When you're baking, you want to make sure that things are absolutely as precise as possible. Now, the one way you can make sure everything is very, very precise in baking is if you use a scale. Now, scaled ingredients are going to be way more accurate than if you were to use volume measurements like a cup or a teaspoon or whatever. If you're measuring things in ounces or grams, it's going to be the same every single time. And so lots of baking recipes actually will have conversions for you to take a look at and say, okay, well, I don't actually specifically need 2.5 cups. Instead, I need 11.5 ounces of flour or whatever. So I would suggest if you're going to start baking a lot, getting a scale is super important. When you're baking as well, one of the things you want to try to do too is if you are using volume measurements, you want to try to make sure that you're using these volume measurements and being as precise as possible. This is baking powder. And on baking powder, you can see they even have a device on the baking powder can to help you make sure that you are leveling off your teaspoons perfectly. It's built into the can specifically. If we were to show you this with the flour, here's a cup of flour. And as I get my cup of flour, it's off the top. If it calls for a cup of flour, you want to make sure you level that off so that you're getting as precise an amount as possible while you're baking. I also want to encourage you to read through the recipe before you start. A lot of times, new cooks, what they'll do is they'll look at a recipe and they'll say, okay, well, I'm looking at my ingredients, I'm going to get my mise en place ready. And so as they work their way down, they just look at the ingredients and then they start cooking. My suggestion is look at all the ingredients first and then read the recipe start to finish. So lots of times the recipes are separated. And so you'll see ingredients on one side, and you'll see the actual instructions on the other. I say read through the whole thing, because what if you don't know what julienne means? What if you don't know what chopped finely means, or minced, or grated finely? There's all these, or poached, for instance. There's plenty of ways to cook something in liquid, let's say. So poached, simmered, boiled. Those are all different words, and they all mean different things. And so you want to make sure you read through exactly this entire recipe, find out what you don't know, and then look it up so you know when you're working your way through exactly what this recipe is telling you to do. Once you've read it through one time, then you can go through and start working your way through the ingredients and getting your mise en place ready. I would suggest doing that all the time. Work your way through the entire ingredients and then get all of your items ready, chopped, put in bowls, ready for you to go. and then start your cooking process. As you get more and more comfortable in the kitchen, you're gonna start working on your mise en place while you're starting some things to start to cook, and that's perfectly fine. The more experienced you get, the easier that is to do. But when you're first starting out, my suggestion would be to get everything ready before you finally start cooking. So that's a few tips for recipes. I hope this helps you, but the couple of things I want you to remember is, I want you to remember to be as precise as possible when you're baking. Try not to shift your recipe around until you really cook with it one full time, exactly as the recipe says. And then make sure you read through the recipe all the way through.